Decades before Harriet Jacobs was born, leading Southerners such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had been convinced that slavery was nearing its end. Tobacco had exhausted the soil. The need for slave labor had diminished. That changed in 1803 when President Jefferson signed the Louisiana Purchase and doubled the size of the nation. 4 new states, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, together known as the Deep South, joined the Union as slave states.
Thomas Jefferson, in negotiating the Louisiana Purchase, declared that he was going to create an empire for liberty. He was going to make an area in which American liberty would expand across the continent. Thomas Jefferson's empire for liberty turned out to be an empire for slavery. The 19th century, the years after Louisiana Purchase, were the period of the greatest expansion of American slavery ever.
The new land was an ideal match for a new invention, the cotton gin.
The combination of the cotton gin and the Louisiana Purchase made the production of cotton unbelievably profitable. You know, the cotton gin increased the amount of cotton that a single slave could produce in a day by 50-fold. What it meant was that growing cotton was incredibly profitable.
In 1808, just as cotton was creating an insatiable appetite for slave labor, Congress abolished the importation of slaves from Africa. Now an already vibrant domestic slave trade would flourish. In the Upper South, the sale of slaves became more profitable than growing tobacco.
Slaves vary wildly in value, from $50 to $2,000, depending on who they are, how old they are. But the valuable ones are very, very valuable.
The slave trade develops its own language. It's the language of big bucks. It's a language of wenches. Of course, this entire language is meant to separate black people from the common run of humanity. It's a language of dehumanization. It's a language of bestiality, to say that these people are, in fact, like animals.
Slave auctions became a common sight, even in the nation's capital.
I got $100 bid. Thank you, sir. Down anyone ought to have hands all over the crowd here. Hard party. 200. Who'll do that?
If a young woman was put on the auction block, one of the things that they wanted to make sure she could do was have children. They touched people's bodies, both men and women. But you can imagine that for a woman it was incredibly invasive. So they were not above taking her into a back room and examining her to see whether or not she was able to have children. Now, this is the 19th century, so one wonders what an ordinary slaveholder would be doing. But they, even on the auction block, they would feel a woman's breast to see whether or not she could suckle a child.
The specter of the auction block haunted the lives of enslaved people.
Slave mothers knew that this moment might come, and they anticipated it, and they did everything they could to prevent it. They lobbied with their masters. They tried to get sold with their children, but it was something that haunted them from the moment that their children were born, that they might lose them.
More than 1 million people would be sent to the Deep South. Nearly twice as many as were brought to America in all the years of the African slave trade. Many of the enslaved were compelled to march the entire distance. some as much as 1,000 miles. To one observer, the procession of chained slaves resembled nothing so much as a funeral march.
And it took everything they had to keep going. And we also need to remember that some people didn't make it. Some people were depressed, some people were suicidal, some people were vengeful and violent with each other or toward animals or toward children. There was a lot of loss. There was a lot of loss.
While slavery was expanding in the South, the northern states were abolishing it, staking their future on free labor. The nation was becoming two separate societies. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was designed to maintain a balance of free and slave states. Yet, the cotton juggernaut would be unstoppable.
Cotton becomes the key crop, the key cash producer in the life of a nation. For a period of time, there are more millionaires along a narrow band of land along the Mississippi River than in the entire rest of the nation combined. This is a terribly, terribly profitable crop that we're talking about. By 1840, the value of cotton exports was greater than everything else the nation exported to the world combined. And that made slaves the most valuable thing in the nation beside the land itself.
As the price of slaves soared, slave traders began to roam the North, abducting free black people. In April of 1841, Solomon Northup found himself in one of the many slave pens lining the streets of Washington, D.C. Born a free man, he lived in New York State with his wife and 3 children.
The idea began to break upon my mind that I had been kidnapped, but that I thought was incredible. It could not be that a free citizen of New York should be dealt with thus inhumanly. It was a desolate thought. I bowed my head and wept.
He was a free person. He knew he was a free person. And so here he is in a situation where it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The color of your skin marks you as a potential slave.
In Washington, D.C., slave auctions were a daily occurrence. Chained human beings were marched routinely in front of the Capitol.
If you can picture Solomon Northup, a free man who has lived a good portion of his life in New York State, and he sees himself in chains, being taken away to slavery. Think about the contradiction. Here you have the federal capital of the United States, the nation dedicated to the proposition of human freedom, tolerating, profiting from the selling of human beings into bondage.
At the age of 33, Solomon Northup was sold down the river, as the phrase went, transported down the Mississippi to the cotton fields of the Deep South.